February 1945 marked one of the most intensive periods of American air operations against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. The strategy was methodical and brutal: neutralize enemy installations, destroy communication facilities, and eliminate any threat to the advancing Allied forces preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Chichijima, a small volcanic island roughly 150 miles north of Iwo Jima in the Bonin Islands chain, had become a target of particular interest. The island housed radio transmission stations that coordinated Japanese defensive operations across the Central Pacific, making it a priority for destruction despite its relatively modest size. Just 15 square miles of mountainous terrain, populated by approximately 25,000 Japanese military personnel. On February 18, 1945, aircraft from Task Force 58 launched strikes against Chichijima's installations. Among the squadrons participating was VT-51 from the USS San Jacinto, flying Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. These three-seat aircraft were workhorses of the Pacific Campaign, sturdy, reliable, but vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire when making low-altitude bombing runs. Lieutenant Junior Grade George Herbert Walker Bush, a 20-year-old pilot from Massachusetts, was assigned to attack the radio facilities on Chichijima's peaks. His crew consisted of radio man John Delaney and gunner William White. Bush had already flown 57 combat missions by this point, earning a reputation as a capable and aggressive pilot who didn't hesitate when targets presented themselves. The anti-aircraft defenses surrounding Chichijima were more formidable than intelligence reports had suggested. As Bush's Avenger began its bombing approach, Japanese gunners opened up with a concentration of fire that caught multiple American aircraft. Bush's plane took direct hits, shredding the engine and igniting fires that spread rapidly through the airframe. The situation deteriorated within seconds. Smoke filled the cockpit, control surfaces responded sluggishly, and the engine was clearly finished. Bush had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could attempt to maintain control long enough to reach water, giving all 3 crew members a chance at survival, or he could order an immediate bailout over land, where capture was certain, but at least they'd be alive. Bush chose water. He wrestled the burning Avenger toward the ocean, fighting controls that barely responded, while ordering his crew to prepare to bail out. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly, the engine trailing thick black smoke. At approximately 2,000 feet, Bush gave the order to jump. He pulled himself from the cockpit and dove clear of the aircraft, his parachute deploying just seconds before he would have been too low for it to matter. The Avenger continued its death spiral and crashed into the Pacific approximately 2 miles offshore from Chichijima. Bush hit the water hard, the impact stunning him momentarily. His life raft had been damaged during the bailout, forcing him to struggle with a small auxiliary raft that barely kept him afloat. Neither John Delaney nor William White survived. Whether they were killed by the initial anti-aircraft hits, trapped in the aircraft as it went down, or died during the bailout remains unclear. Bush never saw them leave the plane. In the water, disoriented and watching Japanese boats launch from Chichijima's shore to capture him, Bush began paddling desperately away from the island. His situation was desperate. He was 2 miles from an enemy-held island, exhausted from the bailout, and Japanese rescue boats were closing the distance. The next 4 hours would determine whether he lived or died, and pure chance would decide which. 4 other American aircraft were shot down during that same raid. 8 more aviators bailed out over Chichijima or crashed near enough to shore that Japanese forces captured them immediately. Their names were Floyd Hall, Marv Mershon, Warren Earl Vaughan, James Dye, Grady York, Glenn Frazier, Jimmy Darden, and Donald Ross. Every one of them reached the ground alive. Every one of them would be dead within weeks, under circumstances so horrific that when the truth finally emerged, even hardened war crimes investigators struggled to document what had happened. The 8 captured American airmen were initially held in separate locations across Chichijima, guarded by soldiers who viewed them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Japanese military doctrine regarding prisoners of war had deteriorated significantly by 1945, influenced by years of brutal combat, resource scarcity, and an increasingly desperate strategic situation. The traditional Bushido code, which emphasized honor and proper treatment of defeated enemies, had been corrupted by wartime propaganda that portrayed Allied servicemen as subhuman barbarians deserving no mercy. On Chichijima, this attitude was embodied by the island's commanding officer, Major General Yoshio Tachibana, and his subordinate responsible for the island's western sector, Major Sueo Matoba. Matoba was a career officer who had risen through the ranks during Japan's expansion into China and the Pacific. By February 1945, he commanded approximately 2,500 troops in the 308th Battalion, responsible for defending Chichijima's western approaches and maintaining the radio installations that made the island strategically valuable. Witnesses later described Matoba as a strict disciplinarian who demanded absolute obedience and maintained rigid hierarchical control over his command. He was also, according to multiple testimonies collected after the war, suffering from the psychological strain of prolonged isolation and the certainty that Japan was losing the war. Chichijima had been effectively cut off from resupply since late 1944. Food was scarce, medical supplies were exhausted, and the garrison faced the grim reality that they would either starve slowly or die violently when American forces finally invaded. Within days of the February 18th raid, Matoba ordered that the captured American airmen be transferred to his headquarters compound. This decision was unusual and violated standard procedure, which dictated that prisoners should be moved to rear area facilities for interrogation by trained intelligence personnel. Several officers questioned the order, but Matoba insisted, claiming he needed the prisoners for intelligence purposes related to defending his sector. The 8 Americans were moved to a compound near Matoba's headquarters, where they were held in a small wooden structure under guard. Conditions were harsh: minimal food, no medical treatment for injuries sustained during bailout or capture, and constant verbal abuse from guards who viewed them as legitimate targets for retaliation against American bombing campaigns. The interrogations that followed were perfunctory and brutal. Japanese intelligence officers on Chichijima were primarily concerned with tactical information, aircraft capabilities, carrier locations, planned invasion timing. The captured aviators provided little useful intelligence beyond standard name, rank, and serial number responses. Several were beaten during questioning, suffering injuries that left them barely able to stand. Lieutenant Floyd Hall, a pilot from VT-82 off the USS Bennington, was interrogated repeatedly about Task Force 58's composition and future targets. He refused to provide information beyond what the Geneva Conventions required, earning him particularly harsh treatment that left him with broken ribs and severe bruising across his back and shoulders. By early March 1945, Matoba had concluded that the prisoners held no further intelligence value. Under international law, they should have been transferred to POW camps on the Japanese home islands, or at minimum provided with basic humane treatment pending war's end. Instead, Matoba consulted with General Tachibana and several other officers about the prisoners' fate. The discussions that occurred during these meetings would later become central evidence in war crimes proceedings. Multiple witnesses testified that Matoba proposed executing the prisoners, arguing that feeding them was wasteful given the garrison's food shortages and that their presence created security concerns. Tachibana reportedly agreed, but with a modification that revealed the depth of depravity that had taken root on Chichijima. The executions would not be simple killings. They would serve multiple purposes: sword practice for officers, entertainment for the garrison, and ultimately a source of food. This last element emerged from conversations between Matoba and the garrison's medical officers, who had apparently been discussing the nutritional value of human flesh in the context of the island's worsening food crisis. Several officers later testified that Matoba justified cannibalism by claiming it would boost morale, demonstrate contempt for the enemy, and solve practical supply problems simultaneously. The proposal was unprecedented, even by the brutal standards of the Pacific War, but on an isolated island, where normal military discipline had been eroded by desperation and isolation, it encountered no meaningful resistance. The 8 American prisoners, unaware of the discussions determining their fate, waited in their crude prison as plans for their methodical murder took shape. The first execution occurred on March 9, 1945, approximately 3 weeks after the airmen's capture. The victim was Marv Mershon, a 24-year-old radio man from Indiana who had been shot down during the February raids. Guards removed him from the detention compound in the early afternoon and marched him to a location near Major Matoba's headquarters. What happened next was documented in extraordinary detail during post-war investigations through testimonies from multiple Japanese officers and enlisted men who either participated in or witnessed the execution. The accounts are consistent and deeply disturbing. Mershon was bound, blindfolded, and forced to kneel at the edge of a freshly dug pit. Japanese officers took turns attempting to behead him with ceremonial swords in what witnesses described as practice for proper sword technique. The execution was botched horrifically. None of the officers present had significant experience with decapitation, and the ceremonial swords, designed more for symbolic purposes than actual combat, were inadequately sharpened. Multiple blows were required to kill Mershon, and witnesses later testified that he remained conscious and struggling for several minutes as officers hacked at his neck. The brutality shocked even some of the Japanese soldiers forced to watch, though none dared protest. After Mershon finally died, medical officers from the garrison hospital removed his liver and thigh muscles. These organs were transported to the officers' quarters, where they were prepared as food and served during an evening drinking party attended by approximately 12 officers, including Matoba and several of his staff. Over the following weeks, 7 more American prisoners were executed in similar fashion. Floyd Hall was beheaded on March 17th. Warren Earl Vaughan followed on March 18th. James Dye, Grady York, and Glenn Frazier were executed together on March 25th in what witnesses described as a group ceremony that drew a larger audience of Japanese personnel. The executions had become formalized events, scheduled, announced to certain units, and conducted with ritualistic elements that suggested the perpetrators viewed them as legitimate military activities rather than war crimes. Officers competed for the opportunity to perform the beheadings, viewing successful decapitation as a demonstration of martial skill and warrior spirit. The cannibalism accompanying these executions was systematic and involved multiple members of the garrison's leadership. Medical officer Lieutenant Teruhiko Aikawa supervised the harvesting of organs from executed prisoners, specifically selecting livers for their nutritional density and thigh muscles for their size. These body parts were delivered to the officers' mess, where cooks prepared them using traditional Japanese cooking techniques. Some organs were grilled, others were made into soup or stew. The meat was never identified as human to junior officers or enlisted men who might have been present at these gatherings. It was referred to as special meat, or occasionally as wild boar, an animal that did not exist on Chichijima. Senior officers were fully aware of what they were consuming. Multiple testimonies from the war crimes trials described conversations where participants joked about eating American flesh, discussed the taste and texture compared to other meats, and expressed no remorse or discomfort about the practice. Captain Shizuo Yoshi, who served under Matoba, later testified that at one gathering in late March, an officer raised his cup and toasted, "To the health we gain from our enemies." Another witness recalled Matoba himself, stating that consuming enemy flesh demonstrated the warrior's willingness to absorb the enemy's strength and courage, a perverse interpretation of ancient warrior traditions that had no legitimate basis in Japanese military culture or Bushido philosophy. The executions concluded in early April 1945 when the last two prisoners, Jimmy Darden and Donald Ross, were beheaded. By this point, the practice had become so routine that it generated little attention from the garrison. The bodies were disposed of in scattered locations across the island, some buried in shallow graves, others thrown into ravines or caves. Body parts not consumed were burned or similarly discarded. The executioners made no effort to maintain records or document what had occurred, apparently confident that Japan would win the war, or that evidence of their crimes would be destroyed before any investigation could occur. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. Within 5 months, Japan would surrender, Allied investigators would reach Chichijima, and the full horror of what had happened to 8 American airmen would begin to emerge from testimonies given by Japanese personnel, desperate to avoid their own executions. The cannibalism on Chichijima was not driven by starvation, despite the food shortages affecting the garrison. This distinction became crucial during the subsequent war crimes investigations, as legal precedent existed for treating survival cannibalism, the consumption of human flesh to prevent death from starvation, differently from cannibalism committed for other purposes. Multiple Japanese witnesses testified that while food supplies were limited and rations had been reduced, the garrison was not facing imminent starvation in March and April 1945. Rice and vegetable supplies, though rationed, remained adequate to sustain life. Fish could still be caught in surrounding waters. The island's defenders were hungry and tired, certainly, but they were not dying of malnutrition. The decision to consume the executed prisoners' organs stemmed from a combination of factors that investigators struggled to fully understand even after extensive interrogations. Some officers testified that they believed consuming enemy flesh would transfer the Americans' strength and courage to Japanese warriors, a belief rooted in corrupted interpretations of ancient practices that had no legitimate place in modern military conduct. Others claimed they participated out of fear of refusing orders from superior officers, particularly Major Matoba, who exercised absolute authority over his command and was known to punish perceived disloyalty harshly. Several officers admitted they had simply been curious about the taste, treating the entire experience as a form of dark entertainment that broke the monotony of garrison life. Major Matoba's personal motivations remained partially obscure, as he provided inconsistent testimony during his trial and offered multiple justifications that contradicted each other. At various points, he claimed the cannibalism was ordered by General Tachibana, a claim Tachibana denied under oath. He suggested it was a spontaneous decision made by medical officers without his knowledge, contradicted by multiple witnesses who placed him at the drinking parties where human flesh was served. He argued it was a legitimate cultural practice intended to honor fallen enemies, a claim that appalled Japanese legal experts who testified that no legitimate tradition or religious practice in Japanese history sanctioned such behavior. The most credible interpretation, based on psychological evaluations conducted during his imprisonment, was that Matoba was suffering from severe mental deterioration brought on by isolation, certainty of defeat, and the erosion of normal moral constraints that occurs when individuals are removed from civilized society for extended periods. The medical officers who harvested organs from the executed prisoners, primarily Lieutenant Aikawa and Captain Teruhiko Sakakibara, provided technical justifications that revealed the calculated nature of the crimes. Aikawa testified that he selected livers because they are rich in vitamins and iron, nutrients the garrison particularly needed. He chose thigh muscles because they provided the most meat relative to effort required for extraction. He used proper surgical techniques to remove organs cleanly, minimizing waste. His testimony was delivered in a clinical, detached manner that disturbed interrogators. He showed no emotional response to describing how he dissected murdered prisoners, treating it as a routine medical procedure rather than a grotesque violation of medical ethics and human dignity. The drinking parties where human flesh was consumed typically involved 8 to 15 officers and followed a standard format. Participants gathered in the officers' quarters after sunset, sake was served, and the special meat was brought out as part of the meal. Conversations were normal, discussion of military situations, complaints about conditions, speculation about when relief or reinforcements might arrive. Several participants later claimed they had not initially known what they were eating, though this seems implausible given the small size of the officer corps and the impossibility of keeping such a secret in a closed community. More likely, most participants knew exactly what they were consuming, but maintained a collective pretense of ignorance that allowed them to participate without directly acknowledging the transgression. The psychological mechanisms that allowed educated, professionally trained military officers to commit and participate in these atrocities have been studied extensively by historians and psychologists. The crimes on Chichijima displayed characteristics common to other instances of military atrocity: dehumanization of victims, diffusion of responsibility through group participation, authority figure sanction of forbidden behaviors, and isolation from normal social constraints. The specific addition of cannibalism elevated these crimes beyond typical wartime violence into territory that violates fundamental human taboos present across virtually all cultures. The officers who consumed human flesh had crossed a psychological boundary that separated them from normal human moral communities, entering a space where the unthinkable became routine and the horrific became entertainment. George H.W. Bush's survival depended entirely on the USS Finback, a Gato-class submarine operating on lifeguard duty near the Bonin Islands. Lifeguard submarines were a remarkable feature of American Pacific operations, dedicated vessels positioned near target areas specifically to rescue downed aviators. The practice had been implemented in 1944 after unacceptable losses of experienced pilots who survived being shot down only to drown or be captured because no rescue assets were available. The Finback, under command of Lieutenant Commander Robert Williams, had been on station near Chichijima for 3 days, monitoring radio frequencies for distress calls and maintaining visual watch for pilots in the water. When Bush's Avenger went down on February 18th, the Finback was approximately 5 miles from his position. Williams received the distress call and immediately ordered the submarine to flank speed toward the last reported coordinates. The challenge was timing and positioning. Japanese shore batteries on Chichijima could engage any vessel that approached too close to the island, and Japanese patrol boats were already racing toward Bush's position with the clear intent of capturing him. The submarine needed to reach Bush before the patrol boats did, extract him quickly, and submerge before shore batteries could acquire targeting solutions. The margin for success was measured in minutes. Bush, meanwhile, was paddling his damaged life raft away from Chichijima with all the strength he could muster. He was vomiting from swallowed seawater and exhaustion, his arms burning from the effort of paddling, watching the Japanese boats close the distance. He later described those minutes as the longest of his life, absolute certainty that capture was imminent, visualizing what interrogation and imprisonment would involve, praying that somehow rescue would arrive. His squadron mates circled overhead, strafing the Japanese boats to slow their approach and marking Bush's position for the Finback. The Japanese boats were within 500 meters when the submarine's periscope broke the surface, and Williams ordered a surfacing sequence that brought the Finback up directly between Bush and his pursuers. The rescue took less than 4 minutes from surfacing to submergence. Crewmen pulled Bush aboard, while the submarine's deck gun crew prepared to engage if the Japanese boats continued closing. Williams ordered emergency dive procedures the moment Bush was through the hatch, and the Finback descended to 150 feet, while Japanese patrol boats passed overhead. Bush was taken below, given dry clothing and medical attention, and informed he would remain aboard for the duration of the submarine's patrol, approximately 6 more weeks. He had been in the water for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Had the Finback been 10 minutes slower, or had the Japanese boats been slightly faster, Bush would have been captured and transported to Chichijima, where he would have joined the 8 other aviators awaiting execution. The random chance that separated Bush's fate from his squadron mates haunted him for decades. 4 other American aircraft were shot down during the same raid he survived. Why had his plane made it to water while others crashed on land? Why had the finback been positioned perfectly for his rescue while being too far to reach other pilots? Why had Japanese boats been slightly slower reaching him than they were reaching others? Bush rarely discussed these questions publicly, but close associates noted that he followed the Chichijima war crimes trials closely after the war and maintained lifelong interest in the fates of prisoners of war. When details of the cannibalism emerged during the 1946 trials, Bush was serving in civilian life, having left the Navy after Japan's surrender. He received briefings about what had happened to the 8 men captured on Chichijima and understood with absolute clarity that pure chance had prevented him from suffering the same fate. The finback rescued 4 other pilots during that patrol, bringing its total to 5 aviators saved before returning to Midway Atoll in April 1945. Bush remained aboard for the entire patrol, participating in submarine operations and developing a deep appreciation for the submariners who had saved his life. He later wrote letters to Commander Williams, expressing gratitude that went beyond standard military courtesy. These were personal, emotional acknowledgments of a debt that could never be fully repaid. The experience shaped Bush's later political career in ways both obvious and subtle. His support for strong military capabilities, his advocacy for veterans' affairs, and his reluctance to commit American forces to combat unless absolutely necessary, all traced partially back to those 4 hours in the Pacific, paddling desperately away from an island where 8 of his fellow aviators were being held prisoner, awaiting a fate so horrible that when it finally became public knowledge, it would shock even a world hardened by 6 years of total war. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, transformed the Pacific overnight from a war zone into an occupation territory requiring immediate administration by Allied forces. Among the countless tasks facing occupation authorities was investigating reported war crimes, a massive undertaking given the scale of Japanese military operations across Asia and the Pacific over 14 years of warfare. The War Crimes Investigation Section, operating under General Douglas MacArthur's Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers Headquarters, established offices across formerly Japanese-held territories and began the painstaking work of collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and identifying individuals responsible for atrocities. Chichijima received investigative attention in October 1945, when American forces finally occupied the island. The initial focus was standard: documenting treatment of any Allied prisoners, investigating reports of executions, and determining whether war crimes had occurred. The investigation team, led by Major Samuel Harris of the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, arrived expecting to find evidence of typical prisoner abuse or possibly summary executions, violations that were tragically common throughout the Pacific theater. What they discovered exceeded their worst assumptions and would become one of the most disturbing cases prosecuted during the entire post-war justice process. The investigation began with routine interviews of Japanese garrison personnel. Initially, witnesses provided standard denials. No American prisoners had been held on Chichijima, or if any had been present, they had died from wounds sustained during capture, or they had been transferred to other facilities. These claims began unraveling when investigators discovered partial remains in a ravine approximately 800 meters from Major Matoba's former headquarters. The remains included bones that had been cut with sharp instruments in patterns inconsistent with combat injuries or accidental death. More disturbing were several skeletal remains that were missing organs and major muscle groups, with cut marks suggesting deliberate surgical removal rather than battle damage or post-mortem decay. Confronted with physical evidence, some Japanese witnesses began providing information. The breakthrough came when a junior medical officer, hoping for leniency, admitted to investigators that American prisoners had been executed and that their bodies had been mutilated. Under intensive questioning, he provided names of senior officers involved and described in general terms what had occurred. This testimony opened the floodgates. Other enlisted men and junior officers, recognizing that silence would no longer protect them, began confirming details and providing additional information. Within 2 weeks, investigators had compiled testimonies from over 40 witnesses describing executions, cannibalism, and the participation of specific officers in both. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent across multiple independent witnesses. 8 American aviators had been captured in February 1945. All 8 had been executed between March 9 and early April. The executions had been carried out by Japanese officers using swords. Medical officers had removed organs and tissue from the bodies. This flesh had been prepared as food and consumed during officers' gatherings. The participants included the island's senior commanders and numerous staff officers. Multiple witnesses identified Major Matoba as the primary organizer and General Tachibana as having authorized or at minimum been aware of the executions and cannibalism. Investigators recovered additional physical evidence throughout November and December 1945. More remains were discovered in caves and burial sites across the island. Witnesses led investigators to locations where executions had occurred, and forensic examination confirmed the testimonial evidence. Americans had been executed on their knees, beheaded with swords, and dismembered post-mortem for the purpose of organ harvesting. The investigators also located several officers' personal diaries that made oblique references to special meat and gatherings where American flesh had been served, though most participants had been careful not to explicitly document their crimes in writing. By January 1946, Major Harris had compiled sufficient evidence to recommend prosecution of 30 Japanese personnel on charges ranging from murder to violation of the laws of war to prevention of honorable burial, a charge specifically added to address the cannibalism, as existing military law did not explicitly criminalize consumption of enemy remains. The evidence package included testimonies, photographs of remains, forensic reports, maps showing execution and burial sites, and sworn statements from witnesses who had participated in or observed the crimes. The case was forwarded to the War Crimes Tribunal, preparing to convene on Guam, where it would be heard alongside other major Pacific war crimes cases. The investigation's thoroughness was remarkable, given the challenges involved: language barriers, hostile witnesses, limited forensic resources, and the sheer difficulty of documenting crimes that had occurred months earlier, with minimal physical evidence remaining. The success in building a prosecutable case reflected both the dedication of the investigation team and the willingness of lower-ranking Japanese personnel to testify against their former commanders once they understood that American authorities had sufficient evidence to prosecute them regardless. The testimonies revealed not just individual crimes, but a complete breakdown of military discipline and human morality on an isolated island where normal constraints had evaporated, replaced by a culture of violence that permitted the unthinkable to become routine. The United States Navy Military Commission convened on Guam on August 13, 1946, specifically to try Japanese personnel accused of war crimes on Chichijima Island. The tribunal consisted of 5 senior U.S. Navy officers serving as judges, with prosecutors from the Judge Advocate General's Corps presenting evidence and Navy defense attorneys representing the accused. The American military justice system required that even accused war criminals receive competent legal representation. 5 Japanese officers faced charges: Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, the island's commanding officer; Major Sueo Matoba, the battalion commander under whose authority the executions occurred; Captain Shizuo Yoshi, Matoba's chief of staff; Admiral Kinizo Mori, who commanded naval forces on the island; and Dr. Teruhiko Nakajima, the senior medical officer who had supervised organ removal from executed prisoners. The charges were specific and damning. Count 1 alleged murder in violation of the laws of war, the unlawful execution of 8 American prisoners between March and April 1945. Count 2, alleged prevention of honorable burial, the mutilation and consumption of the executed prisoner's remains. Count 3, alleged conspiracy to commit the offences described in Counts 1 and 2. The prosecution's case rested on three pillars: physical evidence of the remains, testimonies from dozens of Japanese witnesses who had participated in or observed the crimes, and documentation including military orders and personnel records establishing the chain of command and presence of the accused on Chichijima during the relevant period. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from over 60 witnesses. The prosecution methodically built its case, beginning with American aviators, who established that 9 aircraft had been shot down near Chichijima on February 18, 1945, including the plane piloted by George H.W. Bush. Bush himself did not testify. By 1946, he had returned to civilian life, and prosecutors decided his testimony was unnecessary, given the overwhelming evidence from other sources. The prosecution then presented Japanese witnesses who described the capture of 8 American airmen, their detention at Major Matoba's compound, and the subsequent executions. The testimony was graphic and detailed, with witnesses describing specific executions, identifying which officers had wielded the swords, and explaining how bodies had been transported to medical facilities for organ removal. The cannibalism evidence proved most difficult for both prosecution and defense. Several witnesses broke down while testifying about the preparation and consumption of human flesh, either from genuine remorse or recognition that their admissions guaranteed severe punishment. Dr. Nakajima's testimony was particularly damaging to the defendants. He admitted under oath that he had personally removed livers and thigh muscles from executed Americans, prepared them for cooking, and delivered them to officers' quarters, knowing they would be consumed. He claimed he had acted under orders from Major Matoba, who he said had explicitly told him to harvest organs for food. Matoba denied this, claiming Nakajima had acted independently, but multiple other witnesses corroborated that Matoba had not only ordered the organ harvesting, but had personally consumed the resulting special meat at multiple gatherings. General Tachibana's defense strategy focused on claiming ignorance. His attorneys argued that as island commander, with responsibility for 25,000 troops spread across multiple sectors, he could not reasonably be expected to know about specific actions taken by subordinate commanders. He admitted authorizing the execution of the 8 prisoners, but claimed he had believed they were being executed as spies or war criminals under legitimate military authority, not realizing they were protected prisoners of war entitled to Geneva Convention protections. He vehemently denied knowledge of the cannibalism, claiming that Matoba and the medical officers had concealed this from him. This defense might have succeeded, except that 3 witnesses, including Tachibana's own chief of staff, testified that they had personally informed Tachibana about the cannibalism and that he had made no effort to stop it or discipline those responsible. The defense attorneys faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible and numerous, and the physical remains corroborated the testimonial evidence perfectly. The best they could achieve was arguing for mitigation, that their clients had been operating under extreme stress, that food shortages had created desperation, that the normal breakdown of military discipline in isolated commands should be considered. These arguments failed to move the tribunal. The prosecution countered that Japanese forces throughout the Pacific had faced similar conditions without resorting to executing and cannibalizing prisoners, that international law recognized no exception for difficult circumstances, and that the deliberate, systematic nature of the crimes demonstrated premeditation rather than spontaneous violence born of desperation. The verdict was delivered on September 23, 1946. General Tachibana was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. Major Matoba was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. Captain Yoshi was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. Admiral Mori was found guilty of lesser charges, related to failure to prevent war crimes and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Dr. Nakajima was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. His cooperation with investigators and evident remorse earned him the most lenient sentence among the convicted. The tribunal's written verdict described the crimes as acts of barbarism that shock the conscience of civilized people, and noted that the systematic cannibalism represented a level of depravity rarely encountered even in total war. The executions of General Tachibana and Major Matoba occurred on December 11, 1947, at Guam's military prison, more than a year after their convictions. The delay reflected the appeals process available to all convicted war criminals under American military justice procedures. Both men had exhausted their appeals, which challenged various aspects of the trial, including jurisdiction, admissibility of evidence, and proportionality of sentences. All appeals were denied. Contemporary accounts describe both men maintaining composure on the gallows, though Matoba reportedly made a brief statement in Japanese that translators rendered as an apology to the families of his victims. Whether this represented genuine remorse or a final gesture toward honorable death remains unclear. The Chichijima cannibalism case received surprisingly limited attention in American media despite its sensational nature. Several factors contributed to this obscurity. First, the trial occurred in 1946, when public attention was focused on the far larger Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuting Japan's senior leadership for crimes across Asia and the Pacific. The Chichijima case, involving relatively junior officers and a small number of victims on an obscure island, could not compete for headlines with the prosecution of Hideki Tojo and other architects of Japan's war effort. Second, American military authorities actively discouraged extensive press coverage of the cannibalism details, believing that graphic accounts would serve no constructive purpose and might inflame anti-Japanese sentiment at a time when occupation policy was shifting toward reconstruction and reconciliation. The most significant factor in the case's historical obscurity was George H.W. Bush's connection to it. By 1946, Bush was a civilian studying at Yale University, beginning a business career that would eventually lead to politics. When his near miss with the same fate as the 8 cannibalized airmen became known to reporters, both Bush and military authorities discouraged publicity. Bush gave no interviews about Chichijima and rarely discussed it even privately. His reticence was understandable: survivor's guilt, horror at what had nearly happened to him, and awareness that sensationalizing his escape would trivialize the deaths of the 8 men who hadn't been rescued. As Bush's political career progressed through Congress, the CIA directorship, the vice presidency, and ultimately the presidency, his connection to the Chichijima incident remained largely unknown to the American public. The few journalists who attempted to investigate the story faced obstacles. Military records remained classified for decades after the trial. Japanese sources were even less accessible. The Japanese government had no interest in publicizing atrocities committed by its military, particularly ones as disturbing as systematic cannibalism. The few Japanese publications that mentioned the case at all treated it as American propaganda or exaggerated victor's justice rather than documented historical fact. This denial persisted in some Japanese nationalist circles, even after extensive documentation became available, part of a broader pattern of minimizing or rejecting evidence of Japanese war crimes throughout Asia and the Pacific. The case finally received significant historical attention in 2003 when historian James Bradley published Flyboys, a detailed account of the Chichijima incident based on declassified trial transcripts, military records, and interviews with survivors, including George H.W. Bush. Bradley's research revealed the full scope of what had occurred and documented Bush's narrow escape in detail. The book generated renewed media coverage and forced a broader reckoning with aspects of the Pacific War that both American and Japanese societies had been reluctant to examine. Bush, by then a former president, acknowledged the book's accuracy but declined to discuss the incident in detail, maintaining his decades-long preference for silence about an event that had shaped his worldview but remained too disturbing for comfortable public discussion. The 8 American aviators consumed by Japanese officers on Chichijima, Floyd Hall, Marv Mershon, Warren Earl Vaughan, James Dye, Grady York, Glenn Fraser, Jimmy Darden, and Donald Ross, are commemorated at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. Their remains, what could be recovered and identified, were interred there after the war. Their families were initially told only that they had been killed after capture, with details of their deaths withheld to spare them additional anguish. Most families did not learn the full truth until decades later, when declassified documents and historical research made the cannibalism public knowledge. The revelation reopened old wounds, forcing families to confront horrors they had never imagined, while also providing some closure. At least, they finally knew what had happened. The Chichijima case stands as one of the most disturbing episodes of World War II, revealing the depths of depravity possible when military discipline collapses, when isolation removes normal moral constraints, and when enemies are so thoroughly dehumanized that consuming their flesh becomes acceptable. It also demonstrates the randomness of survival in war. 9 aircraft shot down, 8 men captured and murdered, 1 man rescued by chance and circumstance to eventually become President of the United States. That combination of systematic atrocity and random fate creates a narrative almost too disturbing for comfortable historical memory, which perhaps explains why both nations that fought the Pacific War have been content to let the story fade into obscurity, remembered primarily by specialists and families of the victims, rather than occupying the prominent place in historical consciousness that its horror would seem to demand.